I had the option of either taking an athletic program through each semester or ROTC. Well, I figured that there was a war going on in Europe, and it was only a question of how soon I got into the military. So I figured I didn't want to be a buck private in the military. I wanted to be an officer. And so I was enrolled in ROTC as soon as I went to Carnegie Tech. And when we graduated from Carnegie Tech in December 1941, I got my diploma in one hand and orders to go to OCS in the second hand.
So when you actually went on active duty, it wasn't such a strange experience. You had prior military training and some of the discipline.
I had 4 collegiate years of ROTC. So we had a lot of book learning, and we had gone for 2 weeks into summer camp every summer. So yeah, we were not naive about the military.
And what was the exact date that you went on active duty?
The exact date was January 2nd, 1941.
And where did you go?
Fort Belvoir.
Fort Belvoir.
Corps of Engineers.
And what was your specialty or your job as an officer?
Well, first, we spent 3 months in Fort Belvoir. And it was winter, and one of the coldest winters they had, and we about froze to death in those barracks. But then when we graduated from OCS as a second lieutenant in the United States Corps of Engineers, I was assigned to the 1875th Engineer Aviation Battalion in McCord Field, Fort Lewis, Washington, clear across the whole United States. So I got on a train, which Uncle Sam paid for. I said goodbye to my parents, and it took me 5 days to get there. I found out also that a fraternity brother of mine was in Seattle. Now, we were near Tacoma, Washington, and at the air base, McCord Field. I found a friend was in Seattle, and I got through our Carnegie Tech alumni connection, his address and phone number. So one weekend I went up and visited him, and we chatted, and he said, "Bill, how'd you like to see something exciting?" And I thought he was talking about a girly show or something like that. I said, "Sure." So he had his car. We got in his car. It was about the middle of the afternoon, and we drove and down to the southwestern part of Seattle. And it got dark, and there were nothing but big buildings there, huge big buildings. And he said, "Come on." And so he got out his pass and had to go through 2 or 3 checkpoints, and we came to this huge big building, much bigger than this building. And he hit the keypad and opened the door. We walked in, and I looked around. And I said, "What in the devil is that?" And he said, "These are B-29s." I said, "What is a B-29?" And he said, "It's the biggest bomber ever built." And what I was looking at was the bottom half of fuselages, row after row after row of them. And just the bottom half completely open, but you can see all sorts of stuff on the inside. A tail fin that went 30 feet in the air. And I said, "These will never get off the ground." And he said, "Well, hopefully they will." So when I finished at OCS, I had a week's leave at home, and then I went to Fort Patrick Henry, Virginia, and we got on a Liberty ship. Now, a Liberty ship is nothing but a big tin can that was made in Kaiser shipyards, very unseaworthy. And we left at midnight. And we woke up the next morning, and there was a sea of ships around. There must have been 80 or 90 ships around. And all sorts of them, ships like ours, other ships with peculiar equipment on them, and we didn't know what it was. But we were in a big convoy, and we had no idea where we were going. One night later, there was a huge bang, and then a really big bang, and then another one, and then a third one. And we thought, well, we're being torpedoed. And every one of us, we were in hammers, we grabbed our clothes and headed for the deck, bang, bang. He said, we'd be in the bottom of the ocean if those were torpedoes. And so we had someone check. And what had happened was that the battalion's safe had been chained to a bulkhead in a ship, but not tight. So every time the ship rolled, why the safe would hit that chain and weaken it, and finally it broke it. So this safe was going back and forth on hold 4 and making all this noise. So we went back to bed and went to sleep because, well, might as well. And we woke up the next morning, and we had no idea where we were going. Woke up the next morning, and we were one ship. And we could see flying fish flying out of the ocean. And it was a nice sunny day. We're not going to Northern Europe. Where are we going? A couple days later, we went through Gibraltar. And I got to thinking, Gibraltar. The only reason we're going to Gibraltar is India. And India is maybe close enough to Japan that a B-29, which I'd seen in Seattle, could fly from India to Japan. I was right. We went through the Suez Canal to Bombay, to 80 miles west of Calcutta, and there we were assigned at a military post, an air base, which is just being built. And so of course, I knew very quickly the configuration of the air base. And my assignment was the first thing was to build some big warehouses, huge big warehouses. And all the iron I-beams and corrugated iron would lie on a heap on the floor. But I was able to get all the people in the battalion who had any construction experience assigned to me. So those guys knew what they were doing, and I was able to figure out how these things went together. And so we built this big McCumber warehouse. And then we built some big hangars. And so and I looked at the runway when it was finished, and it was a mile long, and it had a little hump in the middle, so that plane going down the last half of the runway would be going downhill to get a little bit more speed. And so we were building an air base, a big one, and a long runway, big planes, the B-29s. I knew it for sure, and I was right. So we stayed there for about maybe a year, and then when we finished all our work on building the air base, the B-29s kept on flying. Then we were sent up to Lido by train, and that's it was about a 5-day ride in some rickety old railroad cars to Lido. And then we were assigned to a section of what they called the Lido Road. And the Lido Road was nothing but a footpath from Lido directly south to a city of Myitkyina in northern Burma, and directly south of that to a city called Bamo. And the total distance was about 150 miles. And we were assigned a section, our battalion, of that road to build. And so it was just jungle. I mean, really dense jungle, full of tigers and black panthers and boa constrictors. And so we shot some of those. But there was full of a lot of deer, too, just like our deer here in Pennsylvania. So we had fresh deer meat essentially every night. But so we were building the road, and one of the things we had, of course, bulldozers, and we had graders and things like this. When we were building the airport in India, we had the same equipment to build the runway. And all these Indians, at first they had, the women would sit, men would sit and chop big stones into little stones, put them in a wicker basket and put them on the women's heads, and they would carry it out to the runway and put it there for the base. And so we were up there, and we knew that this road had to be a ground link to China. The the B-29s, went all the way to Japan. And of course, they went other places too. Like Mukden, a Chinese steelworks up in the north central part of China. So, but anyhow, we ended up out in the boondocks in northern Burma, and it was really boondocks. And they had monkeys going from tree to tree, and they go whoop whoop whoop. It was an interesting thing. One thing I didn't mention, I said, when we were in China, near Calcutta, building the B-29 bomber base, one day I didn't feel very well. And I got feeling worse and worse, and so I went to see a medic, and he put me in a Jeep and drove me 20 miles to the local U.S. Army hospital. And then the next thing I remember is everything was black. Just black, nothing. No sensation. And then suddenly I had a sensation of emotion, like tipping side to side, front to back, and around. And I was wondering what was going on. And then a beautiful face of a gorgeous nurse with a cap on looked at me and said, "Welcome back." I'd had a severe case of malaria, and I survived. When I was 12, I had a severe case of spinal meningitis, and I was one of 12 who survived without any neurological damage. So fortunately, I have a good immune system. And so it took me, maybe a month to get back on my feet and so forth. One thing I should mention is that until I went into the military, I was 6'1" and weighed 130 pounds, nothing but skin and bones. When we left OCS and training in Washington State, at Seattle, and got on a ship, I was 6'1" and weighed 165 pounds. I mean, 35 pounds is nothing but muscle. I'm not that good shape right now, unfortunately. So anyhow, we our battalion was assigned a section of what became the Lido Road, and we had to cut the way through the forest, put in the drainage, put in the culverts, grade it, get the rock from the local rocks. We had rock crushers to make the gravel, and just build a really good all-weather road. There were times when it was more difficult. The monsoons come from, in that part of the world, from about July through September, and they have monsoons. I mean, there was one week, for instance, where it poured, nothing but a wall of water coming down, 7 days in a row. And so we could do nothing. We just sat in the officer's clubhouse, played bridge, and there were four of us that played, and so we got to know each other's tricks and all that, until the rain stopped. And then we found out that in some cases, when we put in the culverts, we hadn't put in posts at the ends of the culverts so that the posts would keep them from washing out. There was so much water going through these things that they acted like a cork in a champagne bottle. Poop! And so we had to go and put these things back in again. But then we put braces on the front and back of them so that they wouldn't wash out again. The unthinkable takes a while. The impossible takes a little longer.
Wow.
That was our mindset. There was nothing that we could be assigned to do that we couldn't do. That's what we felt. And so we do. And in many cases, you had to improvise. And then sometimes the improvisation worked, and sometimes it didn't. But you learn by doing, and so we got the road built. And the first, one other thing, by improvising, when we started putting road in, we had to cut down a lot of trees. And until we had power saws, we would cut them down, and then we'd cut them up in a hollow way. And I got to thinking, this is a stupid thing to do. It's too slow. So I had my men get axes and picks, and we had some jackhammers, and drill holes around the periphery of the tree. And then I got, as they say, I had 5 holes, 5 quarter-pound blocks of TNT, and I put one in each hole. And then I had all those hooked up to a cable, and then we ran around. See, the road's going like this. We ran around, and if we're putting a cable in here, we ran around way back here, so we're out of the way of this TNT. And then I would wave to the guy beside me and say, okay, let her go. And then he'd push this thing down. The trees would just go straight up in the air, fall down, and we would bulldoze them out of the way. I mean, that's so much more efficient. Now you learn as you go.
How long did you work on the road?
We worked on the road. Well, we worked on the B-29. From April 1st to June 30th, we built an entire B-29 bomber base, 3 months. With all the runways, with all the hangars, with all the barracks, with all the storehouses, the whole works. So the Corps of Engineers were very good engineers. And so, but on the road we worked probably 2 years, because from Toledo to Bamo, to Michigan to Bamo, it's about 110 miles in very, very mountainous country. And so we were there for that long a period of time, but we built 3 different sections of the road while we were at it.
And what was the exact purpose of the road?
Oh, the purpose is very simple, very straightforward. In about 1941 or 42, there was a meeting in Canada of the heads of state. Roosevelt was there, Churchill was there, all the Allied top brass were there. And they were trying to, and of course, the Axis powers were running through Europe, and Japan captured, and of course this was after Pearl Harbor, captured much of the Pacific area. And so the heads of the Axis countries met in Canada to plot how they were going to proceed in the war. And Roosevelt was very adamant about having a connection between India and Japan. My personal judgment was that, in the Corps of Engineers, when you go to Belvoir, you get a real intense training, and you're inculcated with, there is nothing we can't do, nothing, fast and efficiently. And so that was my platform. And then, I used it effectively. But also, we had some guys in our company who had, one of them had helped build a skyscraper in New York. And so putting up steel was nothing to him. We had other people we had a long-legged guy who had worked on a railroad track, running a railroad track. His name was Ross, tall, slender fellow. And when we were inspected just before we went overseas, they had inspectors come along. And so they took us out at Fort Belvoir to a railroad spur. And they were laying the spur, and he looked around and all my fellows, he picked one of them. He said, well, we know what he was going to have them do. He was going to have them drive a spike through a plate to hold the track down. We knew that Ross had done that all summer long since he was 12, until he went in the Army. So he picked the one man in my whole platoon that was an expert. When you're in a situation like that, you adjust yourself to not only thinking about the impossible, but how you're going to accomplish it. And none of these is done by one person. You got a bunch of sharp guys in that platoon. And a lot of them had more experience. Like we had 5 people. We had, one of my jobs when they were building the air base was to electrify it. Well, I'm a chemical engineer, and I had a 1-semester course in electrical engineering. And the major in charge of assignments said, Bill, there's an electrical engineer's catalog the Bible, every engineering discipline has its own Bible. It tells you how to do everything in that discipline. So he said, go get it and figure out how to do this. And he said, and then find out what equipment you had. Well, the one thing I remembered from my one semester was that DC current, once it leaves the generator, you can't change the voltage. And so I had to get the map of our encampment and the buildings and where they were going to be in the warehouses and the hangars, and then find out what the layout was, so I knew the distances that these wires had to go. And then I went and found out that the generator was a DC generator. And once that current leaves the generator, it can't be changed. An AC, yes, but DC, no. So this was a problem. So, and I found out what the voltage was, that it was 110 to 130. So I figured that at the most remote portion of our encampment, we would have nothing less than 90 volts. And of course, right next to the generator, you're going to have 110 or 120, whatever it was. So then I had to run through the calculations using the manual of what wire to get. And it turned out that the wire had to be 1/4 of an inch thick, because the thicker the wire, the bigger the surface, and most of the electricity goes on the surface. So we got this wire, and it was hard-drawn copper wire, and they're very stiff. So we had to straighten this copper wire out so that we could go clear from here to the end of the building and further. And that took a job. So we would get blow torches and soften it up and have guys pull on it with come-alongs to straighten it out. So, you know, when you're assigned a problem, your job is to find out what the solution is to that problem and to do it pretty fast. But none of that was individual, because we had people who, as I said, worked on building buildings. We had people who had worked on the farm. We had this guy, Ross, who worked laying a railroad track. So I had a really wonderful pool of knowledge. And so we were able to put all that to work. And these, you know, once you get the outfit like that going, they can accomplish almost anything.
That's a real can-do attitude. Now, were you there to see the completion of the road?
Oh, yeah. Not only that, well, we were there to complete it, but to maintain it. So that from June to September, the monsoons come, and that's torrential rains. You know, sometimes for 1 week, the four of my and three of my buddies played nothing but bridge from breakfast to 10 o'clock at night, because we couldn't go out and do any work. Just a wall of water coming down. And because of that, it blew out some culverts. So then you have to go back and put the culverts in. And so, you know, you learn as you go.
Did you have a big celebration when you finished the road?
Oh, yeah. What happened when we finished the road and it was opened up, there was a big international celebration. General Pick, who was the commanding general in charge of building the whole road, led a convoy, included Churchill. I don't think Roosevelt was there. And Churchill's prime minister was there. And then the top British ruler in Delhi was there. And then the General Pick, who was the U.S. general in charge of the road, was there. I mean, it was a big deal. And they had this caravan of about 100 command cars and jeeps. A command car is something that will hold 5 or 6 passengers. In jeeps, there are no trucks except for supplies that they needed en route. And then this 100-vehicle caravan went clear from Lido all the way to Kunming. And there was met by Chiang Kai-shek. And he blessed it, you know, because we, by giving him the support we would, and then using this, we could provide him more ammunition, more trucks, more armaments, more food, more of whatever they needed. And these trucks ran, you know, when the road had opened up, which opened up in, I think, June of 1944, the convoys just didn't stop. They just kept on going. And so it made a huge difference to the amount of materiel and manpower that the Carnegie Tech was getting. But I wanted to caution. We also had airplanes flying the hump. And they were flying from the Calcutta area. They had one satellite supply air base and 4 B-29 air bases, one of the ones when I worked on. From these B-29 air bases, the B-29s would take off and fly up to the northernmost part of China. And they would refuel there and then fly on to Japan and bomb Japan. And so we knew that that was going on. And also, I've done calculation myself, and it turns out that by using the B-29s to fly cargo in there, you can move, we could have moved, the airplanes moved about 4 times as much in a year's time as the trucks could on the road, because the truck could only carry 5 tons. And then each of these B-29s could carry 5 tons, but it would take them 3 hours to get there and 3 hours back. You know, it was, having survived it and having been on the winning side, it was a transforming experience. You know, I could have lived in any job in the United States for 20 years and not gotten the experience that I got and the responsibility that I had. You know, I had to make decisions that were workable and would get the job done. Yeah, nothing is impossible to the Corps of Engineers. The difficult is workable, the impossible is doable, something like that.
Let me ask you what you did when you left your station on the road. Did you come home right away?
No. I had not been sworn in when I went to OCS. Nobody ever told me I had to be sworn in. 3 months I didn't get credit for. I missed coming home with my battalion by 3 points. And so I stayed in India for another, probably 5 months before I could come home, which didn't make me very happy. On the other hand, we were stationed in a military camp just outside of Calcutta. There's a lot to see and do in Calcutta. There are lovely restaurants. There are officers' clubs where you could go, and I met some very nice young ladies who were from English families who had lived there many years. You know, it was a nice social vacation. But I was interested in getting home because I wanted to get back and get into graduate school and get a job.
And tell me about that process, coming back. Where did you arrive, and what was your first impression?
Well, what happened, we went from being out in northern Burma on the road to Calcutta. And there they had an officers' club, and it was nice living. But every day then there would be under a loudspeaker, hear this, and then they would read off the list of people who would be embarking that day, and on what ship and on what quay or what dock. And twice my name got called, and when I got there, they looked at their man that had a sheet of all the names on. You're not on it. You're not on it. And the reason is that I never got credit for my 3 months in OCS because I hadn't been sworn in, but because I'd been overseas so long, I was eligible. So they would tell me to go and get on the ship, but then they would tell me I couldn't get on the ship, which wasn't a very pleasant experience because I wanted to get home by that time. But then the third time it came along, and by that time I had made some pretty good contacts in the Carnegie building, which was the headquarters building for the U.S. military in Calcutta. So I was in there talking to a fellow I'd gotten to know, and he was one of the ones who got information about changing specifications for when people could go home and when they couldn't. And while I was sitting there talking to him and grousing about why didn't my 3 points count, and his orderly came in and said, "Here's a new telegram." And my friend read it and said, "Bill, you're going home." What the telegram said was, anybody with, what is it, more than 3.5 years overseas by the end of June is going home, regardless of anything else. I made it by 1 week. You get maybe 2 lifelong experiences wrapped up in 3 years when you're in a situation like that. And then if you have some authority, like a captain or a lieutenant does, then you got to make good decisions, and you got to pick the right people and put them in the right place, or you're not going to accomplish what you have to accomplish. So it is, if you survive, and I did because my malaria was not fatal. And if you survive, then it is a training ground that gives you, you couldn't get in 10 years if I'd gone to work for Gulf Oil or when I got out of school, which I did when I got it. And when I came home from the military, was discharged, I went to MIT and got a master's degree. And when I got a letter of introduction from the Dean of Engineering at Carnegie Tech to go to MIT and get a master's degree, he handed me his letter of recommendation and said, "Well, Bill, now you're going to the second best engineering school in the country." Well, I didn't argue with him. Anyhow, I went there, and it was a remarkable experience. 90% of all the men in the graduate school at that time were veterans. And I mean, these guys were, they were in their late 20s, early 30s at the most. Many of them were married, but boy, from the standpoint of maturity, you're talking 40, 45, 50. It was just being in classes with the people who had the experience that I had, that they had was something that at Carnegie Tech I never could have gotten, because we did not have that military experience. And then even today, there are things that come up, and when I have to make a decision, and I just my mind automatically comes back to the cubbyhole of World War II, where that answer is. So, and not only that, but surviving, of course, is very important. And surviving healthy is even more important.
What was it like to be around so many young people back on campus, 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds, who didn't have that same military experience? What was that like, that interaction for you?
I'll tell you. Almost every class I was in at MIT, there's, I say, 90% veterans. And within the 2 days in each class, the prof would say, he said, "Boy, this is a different world." He said, "You're not college graduates. You're World War II graduates." And he said, "Never the twain shall meet." It was that remarkable. The people I talked to in class, they were focused, no horsing around. And if a professor would not give a satisfactory answer, they said, "Pardon me, Professor, my question was so-and-so." The professors started to shape up. I mean, we weren't there to horse around.
Right.
And then because of what we've been through, we didn't hesitate to express what we thought had to be done. And the professor wised up to that very well, very quickly. And it was a really, what shall I say? The atmosphere, what you was a different order of magnitude than even the best class I had in Carnegie Tech, because there were no veterans there. Totally because there were no veterans there. I mentioned that I had, when we went through the Suez Canal, I'd bought from a boy for about $1 a commemorative medal that Rommel had cast in gunmetal to celebrate the victory of the Axis powers, Rommel's Africa Corps, in capturing Cairo. Of course, it never happened. So I was talking to, and then I also knew that when we changed ships in Algiers, between Algiers and Tunisia, when we were going over to India. And on that the new ship, I met a fellow who, I met a fellow later at the CBI meetings here in Pittsburgh, or in the U.S., who had made the same trip. And so I was talking to him, about how fortunate it was that we were able to go across through the Mediterranean, North Africa, through the Suez Canal, and not being bombed or bothered by the Germans. And I said, some of us weren't that lucky. And I looked at him and said, what do you mean? And he said, you went through there in February. I went through there in December. And he said, we were in a ship called the Rona. It was a big passenger ship that had been built in South Africa and probably held about 3,000 troops, maybe 2,500 passengers. And it was hit by a German aerial bomb guided by a plane. And the pilot and the navigator in that plane coordinated to guide that bomb, about this long and about that big around, to hit this troop ship. Blew the front half of it out. About 1,500 people died. And I was sitting across the table from a guy at this CBI meeting, and he was on that ship. And he was one of the lucky ones. And the bomb hit about 5 in the afternoon, and they pulled him out of the water at 1 o'clock in the morning. And so I went, and then he said, have you ever heard about the ship the Rhone? And I said, no. And he said, here's the book, read it. And so I bought a copy of the book, and I have it. So, there are many more stories like that. I have another 2 of them. One of them was the British decided when they were, the Americans, when they were going to invade Sicily, that they wanted to somehow deceive the Nazis as to what their destination would be. Because they would have to get all the troops lined up and all the boats and the cannons and whatever somewhere along the Mediterranean shore in southern France, which they'd taken over by that time, or they couldn't in southern Italy because Italy was still in other hands. But there were several islands in the Mediterranean, and then also there's North Africa. And so this Rhoda was going, a troop ship, through Gibraltar to Tunisia, and then on to Algiers. And the pilot, the German pilot, was flying over at the same time with one of these guided bombs. And he zeroed in on that ship and hit it and sunk it. And that was the only one of those that happened. And the reason was because I met a fellow in one of these reunions here in the States who looked into this because a friend of his had been in a ship that was sunk. And then he went so far as to go to Germany and he found the guy who guided that missile and hit the ship. And they got together to talk, and he said he was a really nice guy. He was only 19 when he did it. And he said, but he was just following orders. And so this American said, why didn't they do it again? Because it was so effective. And this fellow said, I argued and argued and argued for them to do it again. But the colonel in charge would not let us. And then he said to this German young man, why? And he said the colonel in charge was so afraid that if Hitler found that it only damaged part of the ship and not the whole ship, that he would have this guy's, put on the Africa Corps to go fight in North Africa. And he didn't want that to happen. And so this German officer quietly put the whole project on a back pocket and never heard of again except when the Americans published a book on it.
What a strange twist of fate around that story. Bill, thank you so much for sharing your story. I want to encourage you to keep telling your story to whomever will listen, because I know you have a lot more stories than we were able to capture today. But it was just so wonderful to have you here and to share what you did. And I want to thank your daughter, Louise Sturgis, for bringing you here today, because it was wonderful.
I apologize for getting sometimes a little bit emotional, but, the consequences, pro or con, of some of the things that you went through during World War II, were such magnitude that you just can't become totally unemotional about them.
Right. Well, I'm glad that you felt comfortable enough to be emotional and to share those stories. So thank you.
Well, it was a privilege. Thank you.